It was a Sunday, the kind of day where the southern sun bleeds gold across the cracked sidewalks, and the only sounds are cicadas and quiet judgment. You'd never guess by looking at it, but this was the kind of town where smiles were currency and silence bought survival. Nestled off Route 17, the Copper Fort Diner stood like a postcard relic. Red booze, checkered tiles, and a hand-painted sign that hadn't been touched since 1986. Inside, the air was thick, not just with grease and burnt coffee, but something heavier, something unspoken. That morning, the door jingled and conversation hushed. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. A Muslim family had just walked in. A mother, soft-spoken and wrapped in a warm olive hijab. A father, tall, tired but proud. And a little girl, no older than 8, wearing pink sneakers and carrying a tattered English workbook, clutched her chest like armor. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. The room said all for them. They smiled politely, the kind of smile you wear when you hope kindness can shield you. They chose a booth in the corner, sat down and waited, but no one came. Not for water, not for menus, not for a greeting. And then came Ashley, blonde, mid-30s, apron tied like a badge of authority. She was the kind of woman who didn't whisper her opinions. She wore them on her sleeve like proud tattoos. She looked at the family, then at the rest of the room, and scoffed. She didn't walk over. She didn't speak. She shouted across the diner, her voice sharp like a blade coated in sugar. "We don't serve your kind here. Try somewhere else." Silence. A different kind now. Colder. Tighter. The father stood slowly. The mother whispered something to the little girl in Arabic. Soft, soothing, like trying to wrap a child in dignity, even as the world tears it away. The girl blinked, confused. She tugged on her mother's sleeve and asked, her voice barely a tremble, "Why are we not welcome?" And that should have been the moment someone stood up. But no one moved. One couple lowered their eyes. A man in uniform sipped his coffee. An elderly woman clenched her purse. The only sound was the scraping of the little girl's chair as she stood to leave. And just like that, they were gone. But what Ashley didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Justice had already entered the diner. And it wasn't wearing a badge. It was wearing a suit and a knowing smile. Because sitting in the last booth, back straight, eyes like steel beneath calm brows, was a man who had spent his entire life waiting for moments like this. A man who'd fought courtrooms and council chambers, and now sat watching hatred served cold on chipped ceramic plates. His name was Elijah Brooks, and he was the mayor. But today, in this diner, no one recognized him. Not yet. He sat still, the weight of what he had witnessed tightening in his chest like a fist. Elijah Brooks, 52 years old, impeccably dressed, was not the kind of man you'd expect to fade in the background. But in a town like Miller's Gap, when you're a black man in a suit, people don't see you. They see a question they don't want to ask. He had come to this diner that morning not for pancakes or peace, but to observe the town he had just been elected to lead. His victory had been narrow, bruising. His campaign filled with threats masked as tradition. Keep Miller's Gap for Miller's own. The flyers had whispered, as if he wasn't born just 4 miles out, as if his skin disqualified his roots. But Elijah had won, barely, and now he was here, watching, listening, waiting. When the Muslim family walked in, he'd known by the way the room shifted, like a tide retreating from what it feared. He noticed Ashley before she opened her mouth, the stiffness in her shoulders, the twitch of her lips, like cruelty was something she anticipated savoring. And when she spoke, it was confirmation, the bile-drenched certainty of someone who had never been told no. Elijah said nothing as the family left, his breath slow, eyes fixed on the door long after it closed behind him. He wasn't shocked. He was tired, because this wasn't just about one woman's hatred. It was about all the people who saw it and said nothing. All the people who stared into their coffee cups as a child learned that even breakfast could be denied with a smile. He waited, let the silence stretch. Let Ashley think she had won. She strutted around the diner like a queen who defended her castle, laughing with the cook, joking with 2 regulars. One of them muttered something about people needing to know their place. She laughed too loudly, but Elijah stood up slowly, deliberately. his presence finally catching her eye. She approached, her tone shifting into the kind of false friendliness that had barbed wire beneath it. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, smiling with too many teeth. Elijah looked at her, long enough to make her uneasy. Then he asked, "What's your name?" She blinked, confused. "Ashley." "Why?" He nodded once. "You'll be hearing from me very soon." Her face flickered, a tiny crack in her arrogance. "Excuse me?" she asked, now with less certainty. Elijah didn't answer. He simply pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and walked out the door with the kind of calm that only comes from power wielded patiently. Outside, the air smelled different, as if the town had exhaled but didn't know why. Elijah dialed a number. On the other end, a woman answered. "This is Leona," she said, sharp and professional. "Get me every civil complaint filed against the Copper Fork Diner in the last 5 years." Elijah said, "Discrimination, harassment, health violations. I want it all." "And Leona?" A pause. "Yes, Mayor. We're gonna clean house. Quietly and thoroughly." He hung up. Behind him, the diner door swung open, and Ashley stood in the frame, squinting against the sunlight, trying to place the man who had just walked out. She still didn't know, but she would, because Elijah Brooks wasn't just a mayor. He was a man who had built his entire career fighting this exact kind of rot. He had stared down police unions, exposed corruption in schools, and sued city councils who thought time would protect their sins. And now he had found something in his own town. Something small, something ugly, something perfect. He hadn't planned to act today. But when injustice taps you on the shoulder while you're sipping your coffee, you don't ignore it. You rise. The waitress thought she had served humiliation and walked away with pride. What she didn't know was that she had just served herself up on a silver platter. And Elijah had just taken his first bite. There's a kind of racism that doesn't scream. It doesn't march. It doesn't burn crosses on lawns. It sits. It smiles. It tips its hat and says, "Bless your heart," while it locks the door behind you. Miller's Gap was that kind of town. The kind that prided itself on being peaceful, on Sunday sermons, Friday football, and the kind of quiet where everybody knew everybody else's business and pretended they didn't. But behind the picket fences and the American flags fluttering on porches, there were stories. Stories that never made the papers. Stories that never needed to, because they always ended the same way. With silence, with nothing, with no justice, no outrage, no change. Ashley Porter wasn't a monster, at least not in the way that stories like to paint villains. She was homegrown, raised in the very diner. She now ruled with a smirk and a spatula. Her father, Dale Porter, had opened the Copper Fork Diner in 1983 and built it with callous hands and contempt disguised as tradition. He taught Ashley how to fry eggs, how to sweeten tea, and how to make people feel unwelcome without ever raising her voice. Dale didn't believe in change. He believed in roots. Roots that only stretched in one direction. Down, never forward. And Ashley, she believed in what he left behind. Every inch of the Copper Fork felt like her birthright. She'd fire employees who questioned her. She'd mock anyone who didn't look like they belonged. And when someone complained, she'd laugh and pour another coffee for the sheriff, who just happened to be her uncle. In Miller's Gap, blood ran thicker than law. Elijah Brooks knew this kind of rot. He'd seen it 100 different ways in 100 different towns. But this one stung more, because this was his town now. And the moment Ashley opened her mouth in that diner, he realized what he was up against. Not just one bigot in an apron, but an entire structure built to protect her. The mayor's office hadn't even cooled from the swearing-in ceremony when Leona, his assistant, called back. Her voice was tight. "We found complaints, sir. More than a dozen. Refusals of service. Racial slurs. Employees quitting over harassment. But none of them ever escalated. They all just disappeared." Elijah closed his eyes. He didn't need to ask why. He knew this wasn't incompetence. This was suppression. Calculated. Intentional. Protected. Later that night, Ashley sat at the town's only bar, bragging to a few of her regulars. "You should have seen him," she said, whiskey sloshing in her glass. "Acted like they belonged here, like we owe him pancakes or something." One man laughed so hard he choked on his beer. Another offered a toast to keeping Miller's Gap pure. And behind the bar, a bartender named Cassie wiped down a glass and said nothing. But her eyes said everything. She'd seen it all before, too many times. She watched families shrink and leave, watched Ashley turn away black teenagers, mock Hispanic accents, and tell a Sikh trucker to shave if he wanted to eat here. But Cassie had bills, a kid in school, and silence in Miller's Gap paid more than courage ever did. But not this time, because outside the bar, parked quietly under a flickering streetlight, Elijah sat in his car and listened. A small device tucked into his blazer pocket recorded every word. He hadn't come here to catch Ashley. He came to understand an ecosystem that let her thrive. And now, he had everything he needed. Tomorrow, he would contact the Human Rights Commission. Tomorrow, he would meet with the state attorney's office. But tonight, he sat alone and let the furies settle in his bones like winter. He thought about the little girl in pink sneakers, asking her mother why they weren't welcome. He thought about the cowardice in that diner, the hush, the stillness, the way injustice didn't scream. It settled. Like dust, injustice doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it wears a name tag and hands you a menu. But Elijah Brooks had eaten in too many places like that, and he had a bitter taste in his mouth. The town slept soundly that night, wrapped in the false comfort of habit and ignorance. Street lamps buzzed softly over empty roads. Porch lights flickered behind closed curtains. And no one, not Ashley, not the sheriff, not even the preacher who shook Elijah's hand last Sunday, knew that the ground beneath them had already started to shift. Because secrets don't stay buried when the wrong man digs them up. Elijah didn't sleep. He sat in his home office under the dim glow of a single desk lamp, reviewing every line of the complaints Leona had unearthed. Names he recognized, stories he vaguely remembered, all of them dismissed, ignored, quietly filed away by town officials who believed silence was safer than accountability. A waitress who screamed at a biracial couple. A cook who carved a swastika into a bench and laughed when a Jewish family sat there. A teenager told to go back to her jungle when she applied for a summer job. Elijah closed the file slowly, not out of exhaustion, but resolve. He wasn't just going to shut down the copper fork. He was going to make the entire town look at itself in the mirror and not look away. The next morning came quietly, a stillness before a storm no one knew was coming. Ashley pulled into the diner parking lot in her usual pickup truck, the back windows still plastered with her "Support Local Police" sticker, her keys jangling like victory in her hand. She noticed nothing strange. Not the unfamiliar black SUV parked across the street. Not the woman with a camera sipping coffee across the road. Not the silence inside when she turned on the lights. But at Town Hall, a different kind of heat had started to rise. Elijah held a press conference at 10:15 a.m. sharp. Calm, measured, and devastating. He stood at the podium, cameras flashing, flanked by civil rights attorneys, a representative from the State Human Rights Division, and a woman no one expected, Cassie, the bartender. Cassie stood to Elijah's left, pale but steady. Her voice cracked once, but never broke. She told everything, what she'd seen, what she'd heard, what she'd recorded. Her voice carried through speakers, televisions, live streams, into the homes of people who had spent their whole lives pretending the town was peaceful, pretending the whispers weren't real. But now, the pretense was over. Elijah presented documented patterns of discrimination, witness statements, employee testimonies, and a damning paper trail of cover-ups and unfiled reports. He didn't name names to start. He didn't need to. He let the facts speak first. Because facts, when presented with courage, are louder than hate. But just before closing, he leaned forward into the microphone, and then he dropped the bomb. Ashley Porter, he said, voice firm, owner and operator of the Copper Fork Diner, has been named in no fewer than 9 discrimination complaints, all suppressed by her family's connections in local law enforcement. Effective immediately, I am issuing a request for a full state-level investigation. The room exploded. Shouts, flashes, reporters scrambling for position. But Elijah didn't flinch. He looked down for a beat, then back up. This isn't about one waitress. It's about what we've allowed in silence, what we've tolerated in fear. That ends today. At the diner, Ashley was pouring coffee when her phone buzzed violently on the counter. The screen was flooded. Missed calls, voicemails, texts. She clicked the local news link just in time to see her face plastered across the screen, under a headline that would make her blood turn to ice. Mayor called for investigation into hateful conduct at local diner. She stared at the screen, lips parting as if to protest. But there was no one left to hear her version. No one left to protect her. Not even her uncle, Sheriff Doyle, who had quietly been put on administrative leave that same morning. Pending review of neglect of duty, the town felt it, like thunder rolling in the belly of a sleeping valley. That uneasy tremor when the old rules stopped working. The whispers began, in barbershops, in school parking lots, at church potlucks. Did you hear about Ashley? The mayor's serious, isn't he? You think this town's really changing? But change doesn't come softly to places like Miller's Gap. It comes with resistance, with betrayal, with people forced to pick sides they'd rather ignore. And Elijah knew what came next would be uglier than what had already passed. Because the truth wasn't just coming to the surface. It was bringing bodies with it. The Copper Fork Diner sat under gray skies like a relic from another century. The kind of place time forgot. At least, that's what they told themselves. But time hadn't forgotten. It had been recording quietly, silently, marking every offense, every cruelty, every cover-up in the town ledger that people never thought would come due. But now it had. Because when the state investigators arrived with their cameras, with their clipboards, with their questions, Ashley finally realized what it meant to be seen. Not admired, not feared, seen in the full ugliness of who she was. Stripped of reputation, stripped of legacy, stripped of her family's shield. And still, she smirked, smug, untouchable. "You people have nothing," she said to the lead investigator, a young woman with eyes hard as flint. "You're wasting your time." But they weren't, because the investigator leaned in slowly and replied, "Ma'am, this isn't about a complaint anymore. It's about a crime scene." Ashley blinked. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice suddenly brittle. The woman didn't respond. She turned and signaled her team toward the back of the diner, the pantry, the basement entrance, a trap door that hadn't been opened in years. And beneath it, dust thick as secrets, stale air, and more than anyone had ever expected. What they found wasn't just mold or old furniture. They found documents, boxes of them, employee records rewritten with fake terminations, videotapes marked with dates and names, some of which matched the complaints Elijah had reviewed. And then they found the photographs, dozens of Polaroids, immigrants, teens, black customers, Muslim families. Each photo had something written in Sharpie, slurs, mocking captions, crude nicknames, evidence of humiliation, taken like trophies. Some showed diners mid-bite, unaware they were being documented. Others showed damage, graffiti on their cars, food intentionally ruined. One picture showed a plate of pancakes soaked in dishwater, the word "goat lover" scrawled on the check beneath it. These weren't just the actions of a hateful employee. This was a ritual, a culture, a coordinated effort to shame and push out anyone who didn't look like Ashley and her regulars. And at the bottom of the stack, one picture that froze the investigators in their tracks. A little girl, brown skin, pink sneakers, the one from the day Elijah had walked in. The photo had been printed just 2 nights before, and written across it in red marker were the words, "Not in our America." The lead investigator quietly bagged the evidence. Her hands shook. Elijah arrived 10 minutes later. He didn't speak at first. He stood in the back room, staring down into the musty cellar where everything lay, ugly and undeniable. Then, slowly, he walked down the wooden steps, his footsteps heavy with purpose. He picked up one of the files, opened it, and nodded. "This," he said softly, "this is what happens when people think no one's watching." He turned to Ashley, now pale, cornered, her lips pressed so tightly they nearly vanished into her face. You thought cruelty was tradition. You thought no one would care. You were wrong. Ashley was arrested on the spot, charged not only with discrimination, but conspiracy, harassment, destruction of civil rights records, and criminal retaliation. And her uncle, Sheriff Doyle, his silence cost him more than his badge. The investigation uncovered falsified reports, misplaced evidence, and a private email chain between him, Ashley, and several other town officials. Emails mocking victims, strategizing ways to dismiss cases, even joking about Elijah's campaign with racial slurs. The town's image cracked, then it shattered. Reporters descended. National news picked it up. Small town bigotry exposed by mayor's quiet visit to diner. Elijah wasn't surprised by the headlines, but he was stunned by what came next, because something shifted. The people who had kept quiet for years spoke. An old teacher who remembered a boy expelled for disrespecting authority after asking to wear a kufi during Black History Month. A former waitress who fled town after Ashley threw hot coffee at her and the sheriff told her to get over it. Stories pouring like floodwater, each one pulling the mask off the town inch by inch. The Copper Fork was permanently shut down. A local church offered its building for anti-discrimination workshops. And Cassie, the bartender who broke the silence, was offered position in the mayor's new Human Rights Committee. Elijah didn't smile. Not yet. Justice had been set in motion. But healing was something else entirely. He stood outside the boarded-up diner one evening, watching the last of signs being torn down. He wasn't thinking about Ashley anymore. He was thinking about that family. The mother, the father, the little girl in pink sneakers. He wondered if they'd ever come back, if they'd seen the news, if they knew that their pain had lit a fire that no one could put out. And then he said something to himself, barely a whisper. We see you now. Because the truth is, justice doesn't always come crashing through doors with noise and fire. Sometimes it walks in quietly, orders a coffee, and waits for hate to reveal itself. And when it doesn't scream, it doesn't flinch. It simply answers back with consequences. Justice doesn't sound like thunder. Not always. Sometimes it's quieter. The shuffle of new faces in old buildings. The murmur of apology where there once was silence. The trembling voice of a father telling his daughter that maybe, just maybe, she'll grow up in a different town than he did. The one he wished he had. In Miller's Gap, justice came slowly. But it came. The diner that had once stood like a monument to cruelty was reduced to rubble, brick by brick. Not by protesters, not by rioters, but by city order and local hands. By volunteers who no longer wanted its shadow cast over Main Street. They cleared the land. They planted flowers. They left the space open, not to forget, but to remember what can happen when no one speaks. Ashley Porter was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison under civil rights statutes. Not long enough, many said, but it was enough to make her name a cautionary tale. Her uncle, Sheriff Doyle, lost his pension, his badge, and the respect of the very people he claimed to protect. The town's police department was placed under external review. A civilian oversight board was installed. One of its first members, a hijab-wearing librarian named Amal, the very woman Ashley had once refused to serve. And as for Elijah, he was re-elected by a landslide. But that wasn't the victory that mattered to him. It was a letter, handwritten, postmarked from another state, signed with only a first name. Mina, the little girl from the diner. She'd seen the story. Her parents had shown her. They were safe, she wrote, moved far away. But she remembered him. She remembered how he stood up. She remembered how he told her she was welcome. And then she wrote something that broke him open. You made me believe grown-ups can be kind. I want to be like you. He sat alone in his office the night he read it, eyes glistening, fingers trembling over the paper, not because of praise, not because of pride, but because of hope. That fragile thing, that rare, defiant thing, still alive, still breathing. Because maybe that's what justice feels like in a town that never had it. Not fireworks, not celebration, just a slow, Steady turning of hearts toward the light. The awkward first steps of people learning to be better. The long, unfinished work of unlearning hate. And the deep, aching question that never quite lets go. What kind of place are we willing to be? In the weeks that followed, other towns took notice. Stories were shared. Cases reopened. Names remembered. The news cycle moved on, but the movement did not. Because injustice exposed in one place sends tremors into others. People began to wonder what might be hidden in their copper forks, who might be silenced in their neighborhoods, and if maybe they, too, were responsible for what they allowed to happen in the shadows. And now, dear viewer, I ask you this. What would you have done that day? If you had walked into that diner, seen that family, heard those words, would you have said something? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have, like Elijah, chosen the harder road? The road that risks everything in the name of dignity? Because hate doesn't survive on power alone. It survives on silence, on comfort, on the lie that says, it's not my problem. But the moment we decide it is our problem, that's when everything changes. So now I leave it to you. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done? Have you ever seen someone mistreated in plain sight? Have you ever stayed quiet and wish you hadn't? Let's talk about it. Share your thoughts. Share your stories. And if this one moved you, if it made you feel something, then subscribe to True Crimes Archives and join us again. Because the truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just waits for someone to listen